You are all very, very welcome to our new place here. For those of you who haven't been here yet, we had enormous number of people who wanted to come to this meeting, and we had to say no to quite a few. I really hope that the ones that we said yes to are coming. So, but it seems that almost all places are fully booked now. So, this is a seminar on EU-Africa relationship. So much is happening in the world at present, in Europe, all around the world, in Africa. So all relationships are really under enormous pressure and difficulties, and there are very many different aspects that are taking place at the same time. And who could better tell us about this development than Geert Laporte, who is a Deputy Director of ECDPM in Maastricht. Think and do tank when it comes to Africa-Europe relationships. So we have asked him to come here. He is going to give us 30-40 minutes presentation. We have also asked two discussants to come here, one from Foreign Ministry, Robert Backlund, and one from the civil society, Concord and Kvinna to Kvinna, Malin Brink. And I hope that we also have good time for you to ask questions in the end. As always, this is being streamed, so these microphones are not for you. They are for the streaming. So it's being streamed directly, and it's very important because this streaming is going to be used at a number of universities next week in the teaching in peace and development studies all over Sweden. So I mean, you have to think of what you are saying. This is not a Chatham Rules discussion. But I'm going to ask, before the discussion take place, I'm going to ask some pertinent questions, because I've followed quite a lot of what happens, but also what ECDPM is doing. So we can get some clarifications and some additions, perhaps some anecdotes also before we come to the questionings and discussions. So we are very happy to see you here, Geert, and the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you very much. I don't know whether this is working. I guess it's working. Thank you very much, Leonard. It's a pleasure to be here. And as you know, Sweden is one of our strongest institutional partners of ECDPM already for more than 20 years. So that's 20 years that we have an intense cooperation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with SIDA, with FUF as well, and other NGOs, because we have been here before for other events as well. So this is really a pleasure to be here. And what I will do today is to stimulate a little bit of a discussion as interactive as possible. So I don't think I will need the 40 minutes, but I will see how things are evolving. And the intention is, of course, that we have more than enough time for interaction, questions and answers, discussion, and so on. Maybe the structure. ECDPM, I will explain in a nutshell what we are doing and who we are. And then we will see why these current years are so important for Europe-Africa relations, what is going on in Africa, what is going on in Europe. And we have a document, the so-called Challenges paper of Europe-Africa relations that we produce every year. And that Challenges paper highlights a bit the challenges of this year, 2019, and also the years beyond. This is an element that I will highlight as well. And then, of course, where can the EU make a difference? We just have had the DAC report, the Development Assistance Committee report. It's a kind of peer review amongst the donor community about each other's development cooperation efforts. And there is also something to be said about the report on the EU of 2018. Then we look at Africa at the top of EU's foreign policy agenda. How is this reflected in the major policy documents and policy decisions? And then we look at a few key challenges. I selected a few of these, but we can expand and have more than that. So this is ECDPM. What are we? We are a think and do tank. We always stress also the do element. Why? Because we believe that it is very nice to do analysis, all types of sometimes academic work, but at the same time you also need to be sure that this reflects what is going on in the field. You need to have a practical focus. You need to be able to support those policymakers who at the end of the day need to implement all these nice policies. And so what we do as ECDPM, we try to accompany the different parties in the implementation of some of these policies. So we work very closely with, for example, EU delegations, EU embassies in the field. We work very closely with regional economic communities, African Union, key players who at the end of the day need to make the policy changes that everyone is advocating in the various policy documents. The focus is on Europe-Africa, Europe's international cooperation, with all the issues there that are mentioned. Policy research, analysis, advice, training, facilitator of processes and broker. We call ourselves also sometimes an informal mediator. We don't have any formal mandate, but if you're close to the policy-making world, you can prepare negotiations and also the implementation of certain policies. And this sometimes gives us the name informal mediator. In total, we have a staff of 70 people of 25 different nationalities, of which also quite a few Africans who are part of our staff. At the moment, we don't have any Swedish staff member, so please apply. But we've had several Swedes on our staff in the past, and we have, of course, always had Swedes in our board. Leonard Wolgemuth was on the board of ECDPM. Ruth Jacobi is in the board of ECDPM. So this shows an attachment that exists with Sweden, but we would like to have also more Swedish staff members. So please apply whenever you would be interested. Now, crucial years ahead for both the European Union and Africa. I think many of you are familiar with this. We will have the elections of the European Parliament in May. There will be a new European Commission. At this moment there is confusion. What will the elections bring? There is a fear that populist parties will take over in a number of countries. We don't know how this will be reflected in the new president of the European Commission, the person who will replace Juncker. We don't know how this new Commission will look like. Will we have, for example, for foreign relations, external action, someone who is as good as Mrs. Mogherini, because Mogherini, I think everyone agrees that she was doing well. She was a very committed person. She had a very difficult job, but she was in a position where she really made the maximum possible within a context where you have so many countervailing powers that it is not easy to do good for everyone. I think as a high representative, she really did a good job, definitely better than her predecessor. We have, at the same time, also the negotiations, very important, of the EU budget for the years 2021-2027. The Commission makes proposals to the Member States, and they have made a proposal to substantially increase the budget of the European Union. For the period 2021-2027, we will have a budget, we won't have it, but that's the proposal. The Commission proposes to have a budget of 1,280 billion euros, more than 1 trillion euros. So that's quite considerable. So that money is 200 billion more than what we had in this period of 7 years under the current multi-annual financial framework. So there is a wish from the European institutions to increase the budget of the European Union at the moment that there is so much Euroscepticism, at the moment that there is so much populism. It's not going to be easy. And then what is also interesting for us, those who follow Europe's foreign policy, Europe's development policy, is that there will be a proposal, or there is a proposal from the Commission to substantially increase the budget for Europe's external action. It will rise to something like 130 billion euros, of which 90 billion euros will be reserved if the Commission gets the money in. 90 billion will be reserved for a new instrument, an instrument that is called the Neighbourhood and International Development Cooperation Instrument, the NDICI instrument. That's all technical, you don't have to follow all this, but it shows that the commitment is there to not only increase the budget of the European Union, but to also increase substantially the budget for external action. So it shows that Europe wants to become a stronger global player, a player in the global arena that has more means at its disposal to play its particular role. But of course, as I said in the beginning, this all happens in a context of Brexit, where we see every day we are bombarded with new news about the Brexit, confusion all over the place. We don't know what will happen on the 29th of March. At this moment, it's very difficult to predict. And of course, we also see the rising populism in many European member states. So this is not necessarily a favorable context to realize these type of ambitions. Now, let us look at Africa. Africa, and I'm very happy that I see also a few people from African origin here, so they can definitely also complement what we are saying here. There was this economic boom around 2000, up to 2012. We talked about rising Africa. But it is only 2 weeks ago that The Economist, the UK weekly, used the word globalization. So the steam is getting out of the globalization. So the economies globally are confronted with a slowdown. And this is also reflected in Africa. While we had a spectacular economic growth around 2000 up to 2012, we now see that prices of minerals, prices of oil have collapsed in the past 5 years. And this comes from an African Union OECD report, Africa Development Dynamics. And the report this year is relatively critical. It says, look, we are confronted in Africa with major issues related to demography, climate, inequality, governance. 42% of the working population in Africa, working population, is earning less than $2 a day. How can you stop migration if there is no future for people who have studied, who have gone to university, who have very good skills, but who have to live with less than $2 a day? That's not giving you bright perspectives. 6 out of the 10 most unequal countries worldwide are African countries. And so we are confronted there with quite some challenges. After the big optimism until 5 years ago, I think you hear still people who are very optimistic, but you also hear more and more people who are getting a bit worried. Particularly the demography is playing a big role in all this. You know that the population of Africa is now about 1 billion. The prediction is that Africa will have 2 billion inhabitants by 2050 and 4 billion by 2100, which would mean that a country like Nigeria would be the 3rd most populous country in the world by the turn of the century. It would have 930 billion inhabitants at that moment. Million inhabitants, million. We were talking billions just a few minutes ago, now it's millions. But it's an enormous challenge, this demographic explosion. I feel sometimes that we are not talking enough about it because it leads to certainly a number of worrying trends, and it has an impact on everything. Job creation, urban development, urban management, climate, environmental issues that will arise, inequalities, and so on and so on. And then you have this report of Mo Ibrahim. I don't know whether you know Mo Ibrahim. Mo Ibrahim was a very famous Sudanese telecom operator, and he decided to spend his money in a foundation that looks at African governance. And normally his reports are quite positive. Sometimes he does not want to grant the prize to an African president which he normally does every year. He gives a prize for the best governor, the person who has led Africa best, and a few times he has skipped that prize. But this year, he was particularly critical on the governance issue in Africa. I just take two quotes. African governance is lagging behind demographic growth and youth expectations. African governments have failed to translate economic growth into improved sustainable economic opportunity for their citizens. That's very harsh language, and it's not coming from a patronizing European who says this. It's an African who says this, and it's a bit a worrying trend. I'm not saying that this is the reality for the whole of Africa. I think if there is one thing that we've learned, then it is definitely that we should never consider Africa as one. We sometimes do this, and we talk about Africa as one continent. My African colleagues and friends will, of course, clearly say that this is totally wrong. We see a number of countries in Africa that are doing very well, but there is a number of countries, particularly in Central Africa, where you see trends which are not always very positive. Central Africa, maybe also the Sahel region, and so on. Now, what are the priority actions? I think I said it already. The demographic pressures, environmental degradation, structural transformations in the economy, stimulating intra-regional trade. I'm coming back to that, but there is something positive that is happening in that respect. We had this year or last year the Africa Continental Free Trade Area that has been adopted. It still requires the ratification by 22 African member states, and for the time being this is not yet the case. But these are promising initiatives, but they will require determined leadership and a lot of improvements in the governance systems, both at the local, at the national, and at the regional levels. So there's quite some work to be done. Something which is systematically stressed by African governments is their wish to really transform the economy by investing more in manufacturing, creating value added, making use of new technologies, picking up on the fourth industrial revolution, which is already one revolution further than the third one, which is mainly focusing on digitalization. Fourth industrial revolution is the revolution of the robots, robotics and all these things. It's true that Africa is very well advanced with the younger generations on many of these issues. You would be surprised, but if you would visit the newly opened museum in Tervuren in Brussels, which is a big Africa museum, there is a robot in Kinshasa who is arranging the traffic in Kinshasa. And this robot replaces a person, and it's standing now also as an example in the museum, and everyone is watching at that. It's fantastic. It's an advanced technology that is developed by a Congolese in a context which was definitely not favorable and which was definitely not so much stimulated by his government. But these things are happening. When I look at payment, smartphones, Africans are making much more use of smartphones for any type of transfer of money. If you go to countries like Uganda, people are much better equipped in the use of smartphones than our younger generations are. I'm sometimes surprised to see this. Of course, not everyone has a smartphone, but in the cities the coverage is improving a lot, and there is definitely there a number of trends which are very positive and which Africa should probably build up or build on more in the future. Now, where can the EU make a difference in this whole context? Just a few words of the peer review of the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee, which is an organ of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. And there this report says that the EU demonstrates leadership in the global arena. It champions development effectiveness agendas. It has beautiful strategies, beautiful policy documents like the European Consensus on Development. There is quite a strong public support for development, something which you will know very well in Sweden, which is always at the top of the strongest public support for development in the world. Europe is also deepening its commitment to policy coherence for development, so that's all positive. But then, implementation, that's always the biggest problem in the European Union. The best strategies, the best policies that you can find, but the implementation is really lagging behind. And there you see that Europe is investing most of its aid in the least developed country, in the middle income countries. And they should invest and target more their aid on least development countries. That's what the report of the DAC says. But now most of our aid, 43%, is going to countries like Egypt, countries like Morocco, countries that have a middle income status. And the DAC finds that this is quite problematic. I wouldn't say that middle income countries should be totally left out. You can do a lot of cooperation, useful cooperation with middle income countries, but it should be probably more in a beyond aid type of feature. There's a few other things which are mentioned, proliferation of poorly coordinated instruments. That's one of the problems in Brussels. You have so many funds, you have so many budget lines, and all of these funds and budget lines and all of these institutions are managed in silos. So each of them is fighting to keep their instrument alive, because that's the logic in which they have been raised, so to say, and they all want to keep it. And this makes it very difficult to bring coherence in all these different instruments. And then last but not least, the EU, particularly at this moment, is very risk averse. It does not want to take any risks, because if it takes risks at this moment, if it takes bold decisions, it means that there could be risks for breaking up with certain countries, that certain countries would be extremely unhappy, and so they want to avoid this. And this leads to status quo as the kind of normal behavior, rather than trying to be innovative in taking some risks and bringing new changes in policies. Now, having said that, Africa is absolutely top in the agenda, on the agenda of the EU's foreign policy agenda. I just mentioned that there is a new instrument that will be created for neighborhood international cooperation, the Ndiki instrument. Well, of the money reserved for that, more than half of the means would go to Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. That's quite important. We also have a few opportunities in the coming years to bring more strategic coherence in the EU-Africa relations. And one of these possibilities normally would be the PostCotonou negotiations. I don't know whether some of you have heard about this, but that's the negotiation between the European Union and the so-called ACP countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, Caribbean and Pacific, 79 countries. We have said as ESDPM after so many years, this is an old-fashioned agreement. This is a traditional North-South aid-driven agreement. It has no political traction. Let's change it. But it's very difficult to change, because the vested interests are very strong. Those who are part of these systems, they want to keep it. And be it people who are ambassador in Brussels representing African countries, or be it the people in the European Development Administration, or be it members of the European Parliament who are in joint parliamentary committees with the ACP parliamentarians, they all have an interest to keep this system alive. And that's really a pity, because it is incoherent with Europe's other vision that Mogherini has put forward to have a stronger continental partnership from continent to continent, Africa to Europe. ACP only represents Sub-Saharan Africa, plus the Caribbean and the Pacific. So North Africa is not part of the ACP ACP construct, which means that if Europe wants to deal or negotiate with Africa on issues such as peace and security, migration, how can you do this with an ACP group if North Africa is not even part of it? All conflicts in Africa are connected. North Africa, the Libya conflict, has an impact on what is happening in the countries south of Libya. The migration issue, where Libya is one of the transit countries, this is connected to Niger, this is connected to Mali, this is connected to the Sahel and even the Horn of Africa. So you should discuss this in a continental context and not in an ACP context. At the same time, there is also an ambitious Juncker Alliance for Sustainable Investment and Jobs, which is widely promoted. It came a bit out of the blue. It was originally called a Joint Alliance Europe-Africa, until someone reminded Juncker that there was not much joint about it. The European bureaucrats, the people closest to Juncker, had put this strategy together, and then 2 days before they were going to release it, they called Kagame, the president of Rwanda, who was the president of the African Union, and they said, are you in agreement with the strategy that we have put together, and can we call it a joint alliance? That was the story. And it shows also the way how Europe deals with Africa on these issues. Africa might be sometimes a bit absent from the scene, but it's true that it are always European institutions who take the initiatives for the PostCotonou negotiations, for the joint Africa-Europe strategy. The word joint appears everywhere, but at the end of the day, it's unilaterally proposed by one side, the Europeans, and the African side is quite absent. Although this is starting to change, but we would like to see more assertiveness also on the African side in the future. So you have overlapping and competing frameworks. The EU seems to prefer the ACP, which we call the accommodating negotiating partners, because the ACP is such a weak institution that they will accept anything Europe will propose. While the African Union is sometimes described as a loose cannon, you don't know what you will get. It's not always entirely structured internally. And this is one of the reasons why the European Union prefers to work with the ACP, because they are based in Brussels and they can perfectly sit together and negotiate a new PostCotonou agreement, even if this has limited relevance in political terms. They prefer this type of formula. And this leads to a lot of discussion and confusion, because what Europe has now proposed to also accommodate the more continental approach is that there would be a kind of umbrella negotiated with the ACP, and then 3 regional agreements, continental agreements with Africa, with the Caribbean and with the Pacific. But it's very difficult to negotiate a continental agreement with Africa if you do this with only sub-Saharan Africa. And it's of course also very difficult for African individual countries to negotiate such a deal if they do not want to entrust more responsibilities in these negotiations to the African Union, because that was the big disappointment of many Pan-Africanists, that at the end of the day, individual African states did not want to give a mandate to the African Union to fully take over from the ACP in the negotiation for a continental deal. And that is very confusing. Individual African member states have major problems, and we know this story in Europe as well, to hand over sovereignty to a continental body, to a regional body. And this makes Africa still weak in the international arena. If there would be more possibilities there to hand over responsibility to the African Union, I think that Africa would take a stronger position in the global world. But we are not yet there. And this leads to a lot of confusion, because you can have on this discussion on PostCotonou or Europe-Africa continental deals, you can have in one and the same country sometimes 5 different positions. You have the ambassador in Brussels who will defend the ACP cause, and then his counterpart in Addis will defend African Union. His minister in capital will have a different position, does not know which of the 2 frameworks to support, and then the head of state can still take a totally other position. And we sometimes see this as well in the work of ISDPM. We are sometimes invited by the ACP Committee of Ambassadors to animate a discussion on a topical issue like climate, and then a week later we are invited by the African Union mission in Brussels with the African ambassadors, which are the same ambassadors as the ACP ambassadors, minus the Caribbean and the Pacific, to discuss climate, and then you see all these ambassadors changing their hat. They, on Monday they take a pro-ACP position, and at the end of the week when they are collected or meeting under the African Union mission umbrella, they take all of a sudden an African Union position. And this is so confusing. And let's be very clear, the same happens in Europe. This is not only an African phenomenon. I was in Poland 10 days ago. Poland absolutely does not want to continue with ACP. They want to get rid of ACP. That's the official position of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But the Ministry of Finance says, yes, but if we continue with the ACP, then we would continue to fund the European Development Fund, which is the financial envelope for the ACP, and there we will pay less than if we would pay our contribution to the European budget. It's very technical, but the Ministry of Finance is looking where they will make the biggest savings, while the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is looking more at the strategic orientation. And one and the same country can have also a very different position. These are a few other things that, of course, are there for already 20 years. The economic partnership agreements, which are dragging on. Europe wanted to have free trade agreements with the different sub-regions in Africa. There's now diplomats in the European External Action Service who recognize that this was a well-intended diplomatic disaster. So 20 years long, these negotiations have been dragging on. In some regions, there is the beginning of a conclusion of these negotiations. In other regions, it's impossible to strike a deal. And we see that this has really soured the relations. Why? Because the European Union has not necessarily respected the rules of the game in a negotiating process. If you're negotiating, you don't mix up with the positions of your counterpart. You just play it hard, and they are supposed to also play it hard. But what Europe did was to finance technocrats, Europeans, who would sit in the negotiating teams of the African countries, of the African regional economic communities, and these guys have double hats. They are paid by the European Commission, but they are supposed to defend the interests of the African countries and African regions. And so they were supposed to convey the message that these EPAs were good for Africa. And that's what Europe always said. We have done studies with our experts, and these EPAs are good for you. Please sign. This is not a negotiation. This is just almost an imposition. You say, we know what is good for you. That's very patronizing. African countries should be able to make that own decision. And they should have the capacity themselves, and they have that capacity, but they need to mobilize it maybe better. But they should say at a certain moment, look, we don't accept your proposals because of these and these and these reasons, which is now happening more and more. A country like Nigeria has said, also the private sector in Nigeria, these economic partnership agreements are not going to be beneficial for our private sector. They won't benefit Nigeria, we won't sign. It took them time to take that decision, but the decision is there. And Europe is trying to put some pressure now on Nigeria, but it's not going to work, I think. So there is negotiations there that are dragging on for quite some time already. A few other things, the consistency of the governance agenda, which is a typical example which has undermined European credibility, and where we see that governance, the democracy agenda, the way Europe is pushing this in Africa is always a bit with double standards. In certain countries, we condemn regime changes. In other countries, we accept it. For example, everyone knows that in the DRC, the elections were not taking place in a correct manner, and that Tshisekedi was definitely not the winner of the elections, but Europe has accepted the verdict. Why? Because a number of African countries were first to say, look, we accept the result with Tshisekedi as winner. South Africa was the first to turn its back. The African Union wanted to send a mission, to investigate the situation, but immediately South Africa, Kenya, and a few others said, okay, the result is okay, we can live with the fact that Tshisekedi will become the new president, even if he definitely did not win the elections according to all the observers. And there Europe followed the line of South Africa and others, while at the same time we, as you know, in another continent, in Venezuela, we recognize the opposition leader, maybe rightfully, but that's something that is picked up also in the African media, these type of things. Why is it that we respect or we accept an outcome which is not correct in Africa, and that in South America, bon, I'm not saying that Maduro was elected in a democratic way, but it's very strange that we take different positions in different countries, and the easiest is of course to take a position in a country like Gambia, small country. The moment that the president was removed from power, Europe was the first to say, yes, good that there is change in the Gambia, because the Gambia is so insignificant. So it shows the difficulties that Europe has systematically with finding this balance between interests and values. In big countries, we don't speak up because there are strategic interests, and in small countries, we are the moral consciousness of the world. And Africans notice this. They see this very well, that this is not always coherent. Now, I'm not going to continue too long anymore because we need to have discussion, and there's also discussants who need to react. But there's one of the things that always comes back, that's the asymmetry in the relationship, which leads to mistrust, this perception of EU paternalism. We've heard this so many times. The EU wants to have joint agreements, wants to talk about everything, but at the end of the day, they never make concessions on issues that really matter to Africa. And I think that's one of the frustrations that is growing. There was a ranking of countries in terms of popularity in different African regions recently, and Germany was doing well. Germany was #1. And this has to do with the migration crisis. Germany was 1, I think China was 2, and then maybe the United States even, but France was very low, because in West Africa they have seen France in action in so many ways, and they don't believe that France is serious when it is dealing with that part of the world. And then of course you see that, and that's very positive, that there is a growing assertiveness on the African side with the alternative options. But alternative options like China, that's nice, but it also has major implications. We can come back to that in the discussions. And at the same time, as I said before, it's all good to build alternative options and more assertiveness, but then you also need at a certain moment entrust more responsibilities to those institutions that can represent your interests in the global arena. And there's still a lot to be said whether this is effectively happening. The African Union has made a lot of progress this year, but there's still a long way to go. Key challenges, I will quickly go through these. The regional integration, trade and investment agenda. There we see that there's quite a few things that has been happening, like the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Europe is supporting this. The idea is that all the trade agreements that exist would be merged into one continental free trade agreement, and that Europe would have a kind of continental or continent-to-continent free trade agreement in the future. This is still a long way to go. We are just at the beginning, but the intention is there, and it is a positive move that there is definitely this intention to do this. Financial architecture, this is quite interesting, that this alliance of Juncker is in the next 5 years going to try to create 10 million jobs. By the way, that's not enough. Africa needs 18 million jobs a year with the current pace of demography. But 10 million jobs is of course quite impressive. But Europe would also like to invest more in vocational training, which was one of the missing links. There's many good academics from Africa, but there's more vocational training needed. And maybe interesting as well, 100,000 students will be benefiting from Erasmus Plus programs. I think it's a good strategic move to do this. And then we have the European External Investment Plan, all these types of funds that need to leverage private sector investment. There's also talk of establishing a European Development Bank. So these are some of the important issues. Peace and security agenda. There we see that the African Union has been doing quite well. There is this Africa Peace and Security architecture that exists already for quite some time, and that has been quite effective. The regional economic communities and the African Union have been mediating in many of the conflicts in Africa. But what we see is that they are still very dependent on funding from Europe. Europe puts money into the Africa Peace Facility, and the Africa Peace Facility finances African troops to maintain peace in certain regions, and that's not healthy. At the end of the day, Africa should be able to finance its own peace operations, but with the help of Europe, for the time being, the Africa Peace and Security architecture has shown some positive results, particularly in West Africa. The ECOWAS region, Economic Community of West African States, has been quite effective in controlling the conflicts that we had 10 years ago, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ivory Coast, and so on. And more importantly even, ECOWAS is also playing its role when there is an unconstitutional change of government. So coup d'etat, or when someone is changing the constitution to stay longer in power, ECOWAS reacts. And that is the way it should be. It should not be Europe that reacts. That's very patronizing. It should be Africa itself. And in the ECOWAS region, we see that this is happening more and more. So there is definitely something positive to be said about this. And then the European or the Africa Peace Facility, where Europe was putting 2.7 billion in the Africa Peace and Security architecture. There's a proposal now by Mogherini to replace this by a European Peace Facility that would be 5 times as big as the Africa Peace Facility. But the European Peace Facility, we don't know all the implications, but it shows that Europe wants to play a stronger role also gradually in military terms, because this Africa Peace Facility does not allow them to play that role. The Africa Peace Facility can only finance equipment and per diems of African soldiers. But this is a change that is on the table in the next weeks to come and months to come. Migration, you know the issues much more than anyone else, the short term, the long term, the polarization. You've gone through all these processes as well in Sweden. There the shift will be, of course, to move from short-term migration management, border control and so on, to longer-term strategic migration governance. That is one of the issues. And this is the last point that I wanted to discuss. This is also a very worrying trend, because you see the enormous needs in Africa. You see the dynamism of young generations who are well educated, who are using the most modern technologies, who are very keen to take part in the development of their societies. And then you see this, closing space for civic action. This is globally. It's a global phenomenon. It is also existing in Europe, Hungary, Poland, but Africa is very red. And this is a very worrying trend. We see more and more control of social media. We see countries like Uganda that are taxing the use of social media. So people who are making use of Facebook, who are making use of internet, who are using Twitter, they are taxed. And this is, of course, a way of controlling your civil society. And this is happening in many African countries. Happily, we see some very good examples where it is not happening, like Ghana. Ghana is doing very well, South Africa traditionally also, but particularly in Central Africa and East Africa, you see an increasing grip of the state on the civil society. You cannot be financed as NGO if you get funding from abroad. you have these type of problems. Features, you see them, legal measures, taxes on social media. These are the realities in many of these countries. Legal licensing procedures for CSOs, for civil society organizations. 6 out of 7 humans live in countries with restricted freedoms. That's globally. Eh? And then you see that this is worsening, and that authoritarian regimes are sometimes calling upon the technologies of countries like China. China is very sophisticated in controlling its civil society, or its society. Face recognition, all types of measures to control social media and so on. And this is a trend that we need to be aware of. And there I sometimes see that young people have big expectations from Europe. They say Europe should stress much more this governance agenda. It's lost. We are talking investment, we are talking jobs, that's all nice. But the governance agenda is essential as well to make these societies grow in an open way. And this is absolutely important. So I end at the end. We always put sometimes value agendas against interest agendas, but I think in the longer term for Europe, the promotion of value agendas in a consistent manner, that's one of the biggest weaknesses of the European interventions, but a consistent application of value agendas is a longer term interest that Europe has in Africa, because you will, at the end of the day, have to fight to win the struggle of minds again and to gain the support of African citizens and youth. And I think there is a struggle of minds going on in Africa. You have the Chinese model that attracts sympathy by some of the authoritarian leaders and also other Africans. But you definitely also have a model that attracts people in Africa that is more a kind of European model. Social inclusiveness, participatory development, these type of things. And this is the space that I think we as Europeans should consistently continue to argue for, making sure that inclusive development, direct support to youth, women, private sector, civil society organizations continues. Sometimes by working in a more risky environment outside the central state. But this is where we need to be more creative, because that's what younger African generations expect from Europe, and where we are at this moment sometimes failing. I leave it here. Thank you very much, and I hope that we have a good discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Geert. You said you could do it very much quick. I expected you to take more time. Now, this will make it impossible for me to ask many questions. I just want to say that in spite of this long presentation, there are some issues you have not even touched.
No.
And I would have asked if you would have more time. Perhaps Robert can come back to one of them at least. One is, of course, the joint Africa-European strategy, which is another, in addition to Cotonou and to the Juncker investment program, is another program which Europe is very much, and Africa is engaged in. Another question which you didn't really touch on is what Brexit actually means for Europe-Africa, particularly when it comes to the trade agreements. I mean, EPAs cannot be valid anymore because Britain is not part of it anymore. So I'm not quite sure what conclusion you can draw from. I mean, there are many aspects, of course, of when Britain gets out of many of these agreements that Europe and Africa has created over many years. And a third issue which I would have wanted you to talk about is this process of the Cotonou discussion, because you really didn't get at all anecdotes. Because here, what you touched but didn't really perhaps give all so much details on is that this has been developed very differently by many, as you said, by many leaders. And I know that Kagame actually brought up in AU that he went against the whole idea of APC. Yeah. Yeah. And he was sort of he was the chairman of the AU that year. So So I mean, there has been enormous conflicts also in Africa in how to deal with this issue.
Yeah.
Not only in Europe. I mean, and I guess your engagement at DPM, you didn't even expect. That you expected a lot of opposition from Europe, but not from Africa in that way.
Yeah,
but true. This you can't talk about that now because now we have to ask the discussant.
I will bring it up later on.
Yeah, it might that the discussant will also bring up some of them. So please come up, both of you, and you agreed that Robert should start.
Yes.
And you should have a microphone. Remember to keep it quite close.
Thank you very much to Gert for this excellent presentation. I think ECDPM is really a think tank that lives up to its name, thinks a lot. And as you started off with, there are certainly a large number of processes that's going on simultaneously. You mentioned the PostCotonou, the MFF, the EU-Africa, and all that, and we can. Right now, we're in the middle of a negotiation. So even though some trends may be possible to detect, we're far from knowing where it can end at. I think, but seeing some of the challenges that you have mentioned, not least the challenges for the values agenda and not least the freedom of expression, which you brought up. I think it can be said that these negotiations and these agreements also is a way of confirming or renew one's commitment to these values that you see are challenged in some places, and some of these areas or sub-areas in human rights and democracy may be difficult to discuss with individual African countries, but may be accepted when they come into as a chunk of a bigger framework, so to speak. So that is at least a positive hope we have, right? Of course, the balance between least developed countries and mix. As all of you know, that Sweden has been very poverty-oriented so far in their interaction with the EU, but also we recognize that in the middle-income countries there are enormous groups of very poor people too. So we will probably want some kind of framework that can address different types of countries and different kinds of relations with countries. I mean, not least since a least developed state may have less of own governance structures that you can cooperate with. I mean, if you collaborate with Ghana or with Sudan, you will have to do it in very different ways, probably. As we said, the heading of this seminar was it stagnation or innovation? Innovation is probably a very positive word to use in this context, but it's definitely not stagnation either, because I think you have pointed at many positive trends, and not least the format for meetings between AU and EU, which is now being, which was confirmed as the format for meeting between the continents only in January. I think that is a pretty good sign that we are at least moving away from these paternalistic structures that you described. Also, you mentioned that the EU has had some difficulties with the joint partnership in some of its ideas they have presented. Lately, the Alliance for Jobs and Investments, for instance. I think that is a acceptable way of expressing it, but it's also a sign from the EU that they want to start testing new ways of interacting with Africa, and also saying that this donor relationship will not be enough for the future. We recognize that Africans have stronger economies now, stronger governments, more educated people, more companies, more possibilities to work in these spheres, and it's no one knows where it ends, of course, but it's a hand that is stretched out from the EU. You can look at it that way. Then we will all contribute to making these frameworks as smart as possible, because to me it was a change in Europe-African relationships that came with the so-called migration crisis in 2015, where Africa was pushed up from almost nowhere high on the agenda. And I think all people who were involved or had insight in this meeting in Abidjan that took place 1.5 years ago said that it could have been done better. It could have been done better from the EU side, probably also from the AU side, and the migration narrative was kind of distorting all ways to build positive relations. But since then, it's also fair to say that the EU has really made an effort to step up the relation with Africa. So now it's much more of a positive note. I think it's more accepted now that migration comes with positive connotations, and migrations is not a bad thing per se, but it has many, it comes with many positive things. It will always be there. So the narrative has changed in the last 1.5 years, and probably it's both the EU and the African side that have noted that that they have to find ways of collaborating on it on a positive note. Also, I should mention, should I talk too long? No. A couple of more, two? This question of multilateralism. Your description of the Cotonou Agreement and vested interests, it's something that is many have said that, but probably there are also more interests behind it. Looking at what was it, 3 or 4 years ago, when the Agenda 2030 was negotiated, when the Paris Agreement was negotiated, that was in a climate that was quite conducive to negotiate that kind of agreements. Obviously, it was at least possible. Now, certain things have changed, and it would possibly be more difficult to start negotiating that kind of global deals. And at least many colleagues at the Commission and the EIS, they lift this perspective as with a collaboration with Africa, with a collaboration with ACP states, that gives us a platform to launch new global agreements in the future, or implement the ones that we have agreed. And knowing that the challenges for multilateralism have also increased. So now I think that was some of the more important things. So we're going to continue pushing towards letting Africa be an actor and not in the hands of Europe. But also, it's not possible to patronize Africa now the way it was when the current Cotonou Agreement was elaborated 20 years ago. Because many of the states, they have more offers from from China, India, etc. They have stronger governance, and they don't let themselves be pushed around in the same way. So hopefully something good will come out from that, and I'm sure it will.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, can you have the floor?
Yes. Thank you. So my name is Malin Brink. I work for Kvinna to Kvinna. For those of you who don't know us, we are a civil society organization that supports women's rights organizations now in 22 conflict-affected countries around the world. And I'm going to be the more provocative one here, I think. I see that as part of my role, being civil society as well. I want to go back to also the title of the seminar, speaking about stagnation or innovation. And I would say what we're afraid of as civil society actors are that the EU is being a bit more evasive. So I want to throw in another word in here. I'm thinking evasive related to some of the key difficult questions in these EU-Africa negotiations. We've spoken about some of them here, but I will go in a little bit more in detail to those. And I'm thinking specifically now that we should take the chance that we do have this post-Cotonou negotiations ongoing and having a chance to look at what's in the mandate for those negotiations now and what we would like to see coming out of the post-Cotonou. So I'm thinking questions related to civil society role and space, and you already touched upon that, Gert. I'm thinking about the accountability aspect of the agreement that we will have, and about migration and human rights, which we've also touched upon, but I'll talk about a little bit from another perspective, I think. And if time allows, I want to also say something about gender equality mainstreaming or gender mainstreaming into documents. But starting with shrinking space of civil society, as you mentioned, and I love that you put up the civic map there, because I think that's very telling that we do have this shrinking space for civil society across the globe. It's nothing unique for Africa. We see it everywhere. We even see it in Europe, and I think that was mentioned also in the seminar invitation. And it's very much true for many countries in Africa, as you said. And what we need, I think, is very strong language on civil society in this post-Cotonou agreement. We need to have language both defining civil society. We need to have language about accountability mechanisms should the parts of the agreement fail. And what we see in the mandate so far is not as strong of a language I would like to see. In fact, it's weaker than what's in the Cotonou agreement. When it comes to the ACP's mandate, it actually just speaks about non-state actors. It doesn't even define civil society. AU is doing a little bit better. There is some text on civil society, but it's very much speaking about civil society as a unified group, and that was also a challenge in the Cotonou agreement. You know, civil society is extremely diverse, and we also know that the shrinking space that we see across the globe affects those different groups or entities in civil society differently. And I'm talking then about people fighting for LGBTQIA rights. I'm talking about people fighting for people with disabilities, or women's rights organizations that are facing now additional challenges in the shrinking space. And for those who are specifically interested in that, Kvinna to Kvinna last year made a publication called Suffocating the Movement. I brought a few with me, and it can be downloaded from our website. It actually interviewed 123 women's rights activists, women's rights defenders, in 32 conflict-affected areas, and 85% of those who responded said that they're being treated and they have different challenges from male human rights defenders, as in they're also being targeted for just speaking out, for just challenging the patriarchal society And that's challenges related to not being invited to different places. It's challenges related to sexual harassment, sexual violence, actually both threats and actually being targeted of it. And also what we see a lot is that people go after their children. There's nothing more effective than going after a mother's child. If they say, we know where your child goes to school, that person will stop often fighting for women's rights. So I would like to say what we would love to see in this also PostCotonou agreement would be a diversity in how civil society is looked upon, mentioning those groups that are actually more marginalized or more challenged by the shrinking space of civil society. And bringing on then to accountability, which I briefly mentioned. And here I think we did have an article in the Cotonou Agreement. I think it's Article 96 for those of you who are interested, where it says, actually now I will quote, that if one part does not fulfill their obligations of human rights, democratic principles, and rule of law, then there should be a measure taken in accordance with international law. And that's pretty good, I would say, paragraph. Now we know what happened in Abidjan, and you've spoken about it before, where civil society actors were to speak, and were actually in last minute not allowed to, because some state delegations didn't want to hear them anymore. So we need some kind of tools for accountability here. We need tools built into the actual agreement that enables civil society to take the space that it actually should be able to take. We need a mechanism for accountability when it's not granted to prevent censorship of civil society actors, and especially, for example, then at international summits. And then I think we also need something around how civil society can bring forward cases of breaches of human rights obligations when parties, and then I mean the two members of the agreement, don't uphold their obligations, especially then related to civil society. Couple more minutes. Good, thank you. Then I will say something about migration as well. And it was up here, we talked about it, that in recent years the discussion about migration has been taking different directions. The agreement with Turkey and the arrangement with the Libyan coast guards have been highly debated. And what we think as Kvinna till Kvinna is that EU actions and funds should not work negatively affecting the most vulnerable people, but seek to improve democracy and accountability. And here comes that good governance screen that you talked about earlier, Gert. I'm not that much younger, but I still come with a good governance point. If the EU has the ambition to decrease the amount of people seeking refuge, then we need to talk about long-term solutions to implement. People are now crossing the Mediterranean Sea because of human rights violation and of unsecure societies, not only, but partly. And the European Union needs to take this opportunity to negotiate an agreement that push for change, that then concern the causes of migration and not the migration itself. We need to be able to separate those two. What is causing the migration? How do we work with that without stopping the migration at the border? Finally then, when it comes to mainstreaming of gender equality, I think it's excellent that we often get at least that mentioned in an agreement, that one should mainstream. But what we very seldom see is actually the mainstreaming of gender in the agreement, if you understand the difference. So you will have a paragraph that says we should mainstream gender or gender equality into all documents. But then we see a paragraph on trade, we see a paragraph on climate, we see a paragraph on job creation, where there says nothing about how it affects men and women differently. And I think that is how we mainstream gender into every paragraph in the document. And that's what we need to do also when negotiating new agreements. So we need a deeper analysis of what gender inequality implicates and present tangible solutions to how it can be improved. Not just ticking the box of having a paragraph calling for gender mainstreaming, but actually gender mainstreaming, the agreement in itself and all other agreements. I think I will stop there.
Thank you very much. Applaud. Before we let people free of asking questions, I will give you a chance to reply rather quickly, but I want to add one question, which I really thought of when you presented. Can you tell us how is it possible, or how does it work now? I mean, we had the negotiation Cotonou 10 years ago, and
20 years ago.
Is it 20 years ago? So far. And they came, as we heard, they came quite far in certain issues. That was a time when human rights issues were high on the agenda and so on. How possible is it to get Europe around to agree on a similar agreement today? I mean, because we have many countries in Europe who are themselves sort of backsliding on many of these issues. So how, when we are now coming into actual negotiations, how far can Europe actually come in these issues?
Yeah. Well, let me start with that, because what you did, Malin, was very interesting. I think it's a good analysis of the negotiations, but we have at ECDPM given up to look at language. Language in conventions, it's quite important, but it's not the essence of the essence. You need to look at practice. How is the language translated in the concrete practice? And that's what we did with Cotonou, because Cotonou, nobody disagrees, is an exemplary agreement in terms of participation, in terms of all types of democratic principles, articles like the article that you mentioned in the case of breach of or violations of human rights, rule of law. We have it all. We have it all. But in practice, it does not work. And why does it not work? It does not work because Europe is overestimating its power in a world that has fundamentally changed. So if you now go to a country like Burundi, that is one of the top 5 poorest countries in the world, and you tell to Nkurunziza what you did, unconstitutional, sticking to power and all these things, the guy says, I don't give a damn, shut up, I go to China, I go to anyone else. So we have this belief still in Europe that we can put articles up in conventions and that the other part will abide. You need to be serious to have these articles respected, and this is not happening. So why is Cotonou having the most beautiful language on civil society, and why is it not working? Essentially because it is a state-to-state type of cooperation with a very strong role of the national authorizing officers who control in undemocratic countries the whole society and who are not willing to share the resources of the Cotonou Agreement with civil society, because civil society is opposition. It's a threat for their existence, for their survival. So this is for me essential, that we always look at how is this working in practice. And the language is important up to a certain level, but the practice is much more important. And we can give evidence of that. We did political economy analysis in depth, and we can point to all the weaknesses in practice. And this is not an agreement that brings change, and the new negotiation for the new agreement will be much of the same. It will not fundamentally change. There was big ambitions 5 years ago to fundamentally change, and now we see that on everything we see that we are making backward moves, and that we will end up with something similar to the Cotonou Agreement that was concluded in 2000 in a totally different world context, as if nothing has changed in this world. This brings me to your remark, multilateralism. I think the European Union looks for allies. That's true, because we are more and more isolated and we look for allies. But it is a false belief that 79 countries, as diverse as the Bahamas or Barbados, countries that are richer than many of our European member states, and in the same group, countries like Burkina Faso, Somalia, Niger, that you can have strong common interests in the global arena. That's not possible. The agendas are too diverse. Yes, you can have strong common interest amongst the island states of the Caribbean, the island states of the Pacific, the island states of the Indian Ocean. They're all island states and they suffer from climate change. These are interesting alliances. And the untold story on Paris, and we also digged into that, into the details, the untold story in Paris is that the ACP had no role whatsoever in the negotiations. The only thing they did was endorse at the very final moment, under the pressure of the European Commission and the European side, please sign quickly, otherwise you will be perceived to be irrelevant. But the negotiations were led by the small island development states. It were these states that had a strong common interest that said, look, we will back Europe on the climate agenda. And what we see more and more is that the traction in striking global deals is no longer with the big frameworks, even not the African Union, that's too big, but it is with small groups of countries that in a natural way are looking for common interests. Nile Basin initiatives, initiatives in Central and West Africa against Boko Haram. These countries, they are grouping their efforts all of a sudden because they have a common interest. The small island states, as I just mentioned, on migration, Europe is not striking deals with the ACP as such, but they strike deals with the Horn of Africa, the Khartoum process, with the Valletta process. So we look for alliances with countries that best fit common interest-driven agendas. And that's the future of multilateralism. Not 79 countries that are so diverse. I think... well, I stop here. Sorry. Yeah, I could go on. And the people have to talk. You know.
Brexit.
I agree.
No. but I know.
Brexit, perhaps.
Yeah, on Brexit, I think you're right that the deals that have already been concluded, they are at risk. But there's still a number of EPAs that need to be finalized. So there's still a long process to go. But those where there is at this moment a common understanding that they would like to go with the Brexit, where Britain was sitting at the same table, there needs to be a kind of revision of these things. The other aspect of Brexit, which is also quite interesting to see, and we also see this in the life of ISDPM to some extent, the Brits are confronted with a huge problem in terms of spending. They are one of these countries that also committed to the 0.7, and Europe was the best way of channeling aid resources. But how will they do this now if they are leaving the European Union? So they are now asking for studies to see where they can still be supportive of European channels of funding, including the European Development Fund, so as to get rid of their aid money, without, in a number of cases, not having any say on the decision-making of these resources. But there is an enormous pressure to spend, because there is an obligation, legal obligation, to spend 0.7.
Okay, many issues on the table. You come back here. But let's start with let the questions free. Yeah, okay. Anders Oljelund, can you? Anders, sträck ut din arm. Visa vem du är.
Hello, do you hear me? Anders Oljelund is my name. I have a very general question. Since you say that most countries, EU countries, are not willing to change the Cotonou Agreement, but to keep it as it is, and those who are willing are not able, my question is, will this mean that the whole Cotonou Agreement or its follower will be of less and less importance and of minor importance in the future and taken over by other kinds of relations from EU, or maybe more bilateral relations or multilateral relations of various kinds, and that ACP will lose its importance? And I remember when I started to look into Cotonou, I read a report from your organization saying that you had asked African member countries about Cotonou. And most of the government officials said that they were not aware of that at all. Of course, a few people were, because they received the money from the funds and etc., or they participated in a dialogue on their own table. But as a phenomenon, as a phenomenon and as a reality, ACP was not considered as anything important. Will this development continue?
Yeah, take a few more questions.
We take a few more questions. So next.
Yes. Hello, my name is Annie Sturinga. I have a question regarding, you mentioned it briefly, but if you could develop it a bit further, how much the EU and Africa relationships are being, how the EU is being threatened by other actors, by Asian actors, by China, Japan, and so forth, and Turkey, who all also want to engage with Africa and focusing more on trade and economics and less on the civil society, democratic factors, and so forth. Is that maybe playing in why you have this agreement on strategy on employment and economics, which is more important than for these African countries? Yeah.
Yes, Alf Persson, I would like to ask, is there anything that the EU could learn from the Chinese way of dealing with Africa? And is there anything that the EU should learn from the Chinese way of doing business and aid with Africa?
And then one more in the back.
I understand English, but I don't can speak so good. So I can say it to Sweden, you can.
Ja, okej.
Jag tänker frågan så. Om Afrika, till exempel hela Västafrika som han nämnde, betalar till Europa över 400 miljoner euro varje år till fransk sjöfart. En exempel. Det är det som gäller ekonomi. Kanske de här länderna skulle inte betala de där pengarna till Frankrike för att använda fransk sjöfart och för att betala skulderna för att de blivit befriade från kolonialismen. Kanske de skulle inte behöva någon annan hjälp om de skulle få utvecklas på sin egen takt. Den andra, emigration som händer nu i Medelhavet. Det är en grej som Europa har orsakat genom att bomba sönder Libyen. Den andra frågan. De mänskliga rättigheterna gäller också bara för afrikaner när de ska ställas till rätta i till exempel Haag. Eller skulle också börja gälla för europeiska företagen som trampar på alla mänskliga rättigheterna i Kongo till exempel. Så exempel, det var grejerna så jag tänker, jag är sydamerikan. Ja, mina släktingar blev fraktade som slavarna från Afrika till Latinamerika. Och så det där. Det har alltid varit en affär Afrika för Europa. Om man tänker så här, hela den utveckling som England, Frankrike, Belgien, Holland, alla länderna, de här länderna är överbefolkade och har inga resurser.
Okay.
Och de resurserna ligger i Afrika. Jag undrar vilka är riktiga intressen som vi håller på nu.
Okay, I'm not giving every word, but he's giving examples of what you said of inconsistencies in European
behavior. I heard.
Yeah, one is that the whole system of CFA, Frank. If that would, if these monies would have been, have been used in West Africa, they wouldn't have needed any more support. And also, yeah, I mean, a number of examples of
companies in the DRC.
Yeah.
The mineral.
Yeah, absolutely.
You want to add to that? Yeah. No. Okay, then.
Jag har också en fråga, och det är egentligen två frågor jag har. Och den första frågan, det gäller Ghana. Jag är ursprungligen från Togo som är grannländer till Ghana. Och då, I can also take in English. Yeah. I have bachelor in international and health relationships, so I can take in English. But the thing is, like, I have two questions. The one question is like Ghana, for example. As we say that Ghana is open, you can call your family's member. And actually, when I was studying university, we have a lot of students came from Ghana to take the masters. And many of my friends, they are like, oh, they are good looking. We wonder if they will stay in Sweden. And we start to talk, and I asked them, when you guys finish, are you going to stay in Sweden or are you going to go back? They say, why we stay in Sweden? We go back in Ghana, we will have job. What to stay here to clean assets, work in the health secure? Hell no. And I am from like a neighboring country where Ghana. My father was a professor before in university. He told me that Ghana used to come to Togo and learn stuff like about how the society is working, and also like Togo before we used to have like Europe used to have a meeting or where about agriculture. But now I feel like Ghana is going, but the neighboring country, they are not like following. And why is that? Because when we like Sweden, and we have Norwegian, and we have Finland, sometimes they cooperate, they see each other, they compete. But when it comes to Africa, like for example Ghana, like moving forward, and I'm from Togo, and we just like, it's so close. Why are our leaders now like try to do better, like copy each other and see the development? And the other question I have is that I am so frustrated because we have a lot of young people in Africa who want to do better, who are ready to follow the development in Africa. But the thing I'm thinking is like the migration, because many people, they don't want to stay in Sweden. They just want to come here, study, go back. But to get that, it's very hard to get that. And for me, who live in Sweden, I can travel everywhere I want. And the mentality that I think Europe have is that they think everybody wants to stay in Europe, that Europe is paradise. But Europe is not paradise. And many people will see that if we have open border, that people, young generation from Togo, from different countries in Africa, can come here, study, and then they can go back. But by closing borders, this make people think that the only way to have a better future is come to Europe, and this is wrong. So I was like, what the Europeans are doing, so they can see, I don't know how to get this question clear. What Europe is doing for the youth, because they say that we don't want immigration, but how in the long term, whole board, we can do in the long term to make people stay where they want to stay. Because many people don't want to come to Europe, and Europe is not paradise. So how can we work that the youth, between youths, like people like me, I'm educated, I want to help my country, and I love my country, but I love Sweden also. How can we share?
Okay, I think we have got the question. Thank you very much. Okay, Ruth, the last question now.
Thank you. I just want to, since I believe, Gert, that you're going to try and answer Anders Oljelund, I just want to add on a question on Cotonou. I agree with everything you have said, and I think many of us here are quite aware of that Cotonou, as well as its predecessor, Lomé, are somehow passé. They do not fit into the world political structure as it is today. But I know that ECDPM has been working hard on PostCotonou and has produced a lot of papers on that. I wonder what your own personal expectation is on where we will end on that when the negotiations have started and terminated. And then there's just one thing I want to say to people who maybe don't go back 30 years in this history of ACP, and that is that be careful, whatever you do, not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because what was so novel about the first, whatever it was, Yaoundé, I think.
Yaoundé, Lomé, yeah.
No, Lomé was after Yaoundé.
Yeah.
Lomé. Yeah. Whatever it was, the one that was first, was that it was a contractual agreement between the EU and the ACP countries. It was not benevolence, it was not open paternalism. It was contractual agreement between at least pretending to be equal partners. And they, of course, they never were equal, but it was contractually binding, and that was a novelty at the time. Yeah. And whatever replaces Yaoundé and Lomé and Cotonou, and it should be replaced because it's passé, but we should make sure that we don't lose some of those very essential characteristics of the original partnership, which was quite unique at the time.
But then, but the added is then the question: is it possible in present Europe, even to agree on an agreement that was agreed upon 20, 30, 40 years ago?
Well, probably not. But let's at least be aware of that. It was.
Okay, Geert.
Can I start with that one, because it's a very interesting one. The contract, it's having such a symbolic value, but again, you need to look at the practice. There is a contract, but what is happening in practice? If you have this Article 96 and you're a leader in Africa and you're asked, according to the contract, to be accountable and to justify why you are taking measures against civil society, violation of rule of law, and the other party is not interested in that type of dialogue, what is the value of your contract? You cannot do a lot. If Europe needs a trust fund for Africa and they need money and they do not immediately have a budget line at their disposal and they just take the money of the European Development Fund to put it in a trust fund that they have unilaterally decided, what is the value of the contract? So we look into contracts sometimes as something which is holy, but in the practice it is more and more violated, which does not mean that I'm also in favor of contracts. I think it's definitely the better way to go, but I'm not convinced that it is in practice working. Building on that, Cotonou, Anders, your question, I think the biggest problem with the Cotonou Agreement is that there is no political capital in the EU member states to fight for something new. And this has to do with the risk environment in which Europe is. And so the status quo is at the order of the day, and nobody is happy with this negotiation. By the way, nobody knows
where will we end up?
Yeah, nobody knows what is being discussed. There is no transparency. The member states are excluded. It's a negotiation that is taking place between ambassadors in Brussels and part of DEFCO. The European External Action Service is absolutely not happy with this. The proof is also there in the global strategy of Mogherini. She does not even mention ACP. Nor in the European External Action Service, nor in DEFCO, there is a unit that covers ACP. Before that existed. Now this is subdivided in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. So the ACP de facto do not exist anymore in the European system. Yet we still negotiate a deal of which everyone says it has no sense. So in my view, it will just die. We will have an agreement that will have no traction whatsoever, and it will please a number of people that are part of that system. And as was also said already, aid is not important anymore, or far less important than it used to be in the past. But if you have 30 billion, it can be very important for quite a few individuals who are benefiting of that system. And what the French call clientélisme institutionnel, institutional clientelism, is relatively close to this whole ACP EU business, which exists already 45 years, 44 years. So this is an issue where we are very skeptical about the outcome of these negotiations. We don't believe that this will have traction. The traction is elsewhere, and that's what we see happening every day. EU-China, I think you need another meeting on this, because we can go on this. But I think essentially there is a kind of fight for the minds of Africans. There's two models, and I think we need to be very clear as Europe. If we want to make a difference, we should be much more clear about the value added that some of the Africans would probably also expect from Europe. And we do not necessarily play that card anymore. And it goes back to what you said. What is the difference between Togo and Ghana? I think the difference is governance. Ghana is a relatively open country where you see a booming civil society, where you see democratic transitions after elections. Togo is the opposite. To be honest, it's the opposite. Faure sticks to power, He does not respect the rules of democratic rule. And so at the end of the day, Europe will have to make choices. And I think Europe will gain the hearts of many young Africans, where we have lost now a lot of the sympathy, if we act in a coherent manner on this governance agenda. And the European External Action Service is aware of that. They feel that Europe is imitating too much China. Projects related to big investments, infrastructure, that's good, but that's not our value added. We have more to offer. And we should play this out, because I also see frustration in Africa about the role of China. China is creating major debt in Africa. Many countries will be confronted with major debt, but it is also taking away, in a number of countries, infant industries. People who are losing their jobs. We've had demonstrations in South Africa, in Kenya. So it shows that the Chinese model is not necessarily the model that the whole of Africa wants. And this is going to be the struggle where we need to pay attention to. But what has China as an advantage? I think one of the advantages is, of course, the speed. If you're having an authoritarian run state, it's much easier to take decisions and to move quickly in one or the other direction. If you have a European Union with 28, 27 member states, and you need to decide on every project through all types of committees, it takes time. And that is, of course, hurting the European credibility in many parts of Africa. The Africans always say, look, the Europeans are so slow and we don't see the results and there's a lot of talking. But that's the price that you pay for democracy, let's be honest. And there the Chinese have a real advantage. Well, I stop here because we could go on for...
Yeah, but I think that that you want to add...
If I get a mic.
We even question some of the...
You hear me, but I'm thinking about the people over there. No, I just wanted to connect to what you said about, you know, the implementation area, which is, of course, the key thing. I guess I'm more leaning towards then we need to make that accountability part stronger. I'm not ready to throw out the baby with the bathwater either, because I'm thinking, what are the options then? Couldn't we then at least try to strengthen that accountability? So there are at least some traction there. I think it's interesting that you brought up that, though, because working with women's rights, one thing that we've said is that we're not renegotiating Beijing. You know, the Beijing platform. That's as far as we have come so far. If we would open up that document today, we wouldn't be able to at all negotiate as good of a document as we did. And that's really sad to think about it. You think that we're progressing when it comes to women's rights. We are not at all. So much to the fact that we won't even open up the document. So I'm thinking, let's think about that accountability aspect. When it comes to the lady in the back about Togo and Ghana, I hear you. I also think we have to think about how do we keep the people who want to stay in country. And again, we're talking good governance, I think, then we're talking creating jobs there. And I think the creating jobs side we have, but what about these other human rights values, democracy values, and so on? And then also make it more possible to go back and forth. And we do see that. We see a lot of people returning to countries like Somalia now, where there's stability. A lot of people don't want to stay here. They want to go back. They want to help their country to rise up from a very difficult situation. So I think making that more flexible and more possible to do, I think would gain both speaking about EU and Africa relations. I think I will stop there.
Robert, will do? In the meantime, while you're thinking, I want to underline what Ruth said here before, and one has to be very careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Here we have, I mean, the negotiated agreement from the past, where you have taken note of a number of very important value issues, is something that you shouldn't take very easily. I mean, this is extremely important. It's something in itself that we have an agreement, even if it's not. I mean, I'm a little afraid when you talk practice is more important than of course, practice is what really happens when it comes. But it's still important that we show that we are respecting certain values.
If practice feeds the renegotiation process, then I'm fully in agreement. But there we see that, as you rightfully say, that in fact the new agreement will be probably less open to the concerns that you have. And so it means that the practice is not picked up by the negotiating parties. We will see, but that's my biggest worry.
Robert?
No, only 3 short comments. If the ACP cooperation will vanish, I mean, obviously, I think what you described previously was that it may not only be the global multilateralism but more of a multipolar lateralism that will be the future way of working. And of course, if the ACP cannot respond to these new needs, it can occur that it vanishes. I mean, perhaps not the agreement as such, but the significance of it. I think that is part of this a possible scenario that we have. Another just comment about the Ghana-Togo discussion is what we see in Europe and what is affecting the negotiation about the PostCotonou is not only what migration does and not does. It's a kind of a fight of the narrative of what it does and not does. So we have to kind of always lift up these positive examples. I think it's precisely as you say it. I recognize that. And that is the spirit we need to put into the way we collaborate globally and with these countries, to see migration also as an asset, as something natural that always will occur and that benefit many people.
Okay, now he left. Did he go then? Yeah. Because we didn't answer his question. But we take one more round with questions. Is that okay? Okej. Ja, då kan du säga det sen. Nej, fortsätt. Vi tar det sen.
Hey, Roshan Rydell. I'm from an organization called Palme Center in Sweden. I realized that I might not have been following pace of these discussions in general in the last couple of years, because I was hoping to get a very brief summarization of the status of 2 major themes in the relationship between EU and Africa, at least from the past decade, or the last decade, which was about the agricultural subsidies in Europe, and also the where we stand on the public debt situation of the least developed countries vis-a-vis Europe. These 2 themes that were very discussed last decade at least, and I might not have followed pace as I mentioned. If you can just briefly summarize where we stand on those 2 issues today.
Okay. Åsa.
Yes. Hello, I'm Åsa Tomasson. I work for Concord Sweden, which is a platform of development organizations. I won't ask a question about the migration agenda of the EU, because then I would probably go on forever and ever. And I think that Robert said it very well, that it would be a wonderful thing if the migration agenda could start from what it actually is and does, rather than as the EU's agenda does at the moment, from some sort of made-up version of what migration is and does. But I actually wanted to ask more about economy a little bit, and what strategies there are in these discussions going forward, because you, Gert, mentioned that that the African Union and the African countries are very much concerned with sort of coming up with more ways to work in manufacturing and build that sector. At the same time, when I look at the draft negotiation directives from the EU side, what's being slipped in there is a lot of reference to natural resources.
and agriculture. So in my mind, I start asking myself, okay, we have one very powerful party to these negotiations, which is super interested in natural resources, apparently, and writes about the untapped resources of Africa. And then, you know, there doesn't seem to be as many strategies for developing natural resources and agriculture in a sustainable way from the African side. I might have missed it, but that's my question. Is it there? Because if not, it seems like an awkward focus. And also manufacturing as a way to create growth, just speaking of gender equality, also seems to me to have its own inherent risks into it. Are we only creating low-paying jobs for girls, basically, then, or what are we? What do we want to create here? So what are some other sustainable strategies for the economic part? That's my question.
Okay, I let Malin answer first, because then.
Yes, I will just briefly respond to the gentleman that spoke Swedish, since I understand Swedish as well. Just to say that I think you're absolutely correct, that this is the double standard that we were talking about, and I think that Gert brought up initially as well, that it's that the aid wouldn't be needed, that if these private companies were actually building the societies where they work and not just draining them, we would have a completely different situation, and Africa would be in a different situation. So just, I didn't hear a question from you, but just confirming what you said, I think you're absolutely.
I have one question. Take one sentence. No? I am one criminal. No, I want to kill people, everyone. No, and you come in Interpol or call me, or take me to the prison in every country in the world. But this company. Run on the war, go pay the mercenary people for this industry in Europa. But this is not, never talking at this good human rights. You know, and you say Samsung, you say the Edison, you say everyone.
I completely agree.
Never talk it. Don't say right. Don't want to take it in the court to the Mugabe.
One thing we have seen is some civil society networks coming together to try to make a change. I'm thinking Lundin Oil is one of the proof of that. You know, what Lundin Oil did or did not in Sudan, and the discussions around that, and that's civil society following up, trying to make a difference. But you're right, there isn't anything else at this moment.
Okay, now Gert, your final conclusion, but I still want to come back to one question, particularly when we now bring up the migration and the economic issues and so on. I mean, there has been an effort of collaboration, the joint Africa-Europe strategy and the meetings that have taken place. You haven't mentioned it. Why is it so unimportant, or?
Well, it's let's say I think in terms of political strategy, it's quite important, but the means are not put in the joint Africa-Europe strategy, which gives it relatively little traction. And that is one of the contradictions. The means, financial means, are with the ACP EU, which has no real significance, as we just discussed. So there is a need now to combine these two worlds, and that is in fact the intention of the current ongoing negotiations, that there would be regional pillars, including Europe, Africa and the JAS, under an ACP umbrella. But there, people in the African Union say, we want to negotiate continental deals with Europe, no problem, but we don't want to do this under an ACP umbrella. Carlos Lopez, for example, who is the High Representative of the African Union Commission on PostCotonou, he says regional negotiations from continent to continent, yes, but we don't do this under an ACP umbrella. I don't know whether he has the support. At this moment he's quite isolated, and he's only representing the African Union Commission, so many African states are not following him. So, but that is one of the reasons why you have this dichotomy. The means are with Cotonou, and the real, more strategic orientation is with the JAS. Now, in relation to the questions that were put very quickly, agricultural subsidies, if you would look at the budget, this 1.2 trillion euros, 1,200 billion euros budget. The part that is focused and targeted towards the common agricultural policy of the European Union has been significantly reduced. So the issues that existed 10, 20, 30 years back are of less importance than they were than at this moment than they were 30 years back. So I think there is something changing at that level. It's not the same discourse anymore. But the discourse on agriculture in Africa is of course still on. And there you see two trends. You see those who say let's start from agriculture because at the end of the day 70% of Africans work in the agricultural sector. So let's start there. But you also have a trend of people, including Jackie Silliers, who is the director of the Institute of Strategic Studies in Pretoria and who also heads an African Futures program. He recently launched a paper in which he says we have to go for manufacturing because it's only by creating value added that we will create jobs and that we will become competitive in the world. And agriculture, yes, you can manufacture also things related to the agricultural sector. If you can make that link, that's fine. But agriculture as such is not the future of Africa. That's what he says. Others say exactly the opposite. What I notice is that African governments do not invest enough in agriculture. If 70% of your labor force is working in that sector and you invest less than 10% of your budgets, which is the reality in most African countries, then there is a problem, then there is an issue. On the debt, I think the biggest problem is with the least developed countries. The group of least developed countries are more and more isolated from the rest of Africa. It's not a problem for countries like Kenya and Nigeria. In the end of the day, there is a big problem of inequalities in these societies, but these countries are to some extent picking up with their economies. But the least developed countries hardly get any investment. Less than 7% of investment is going to these countries, but at the same time they are spoiled by China with major investment programs from China on which they will have to pay at the end of the day. Yeah, they will have to reimburse the money. And there is now more and more talk about the enormous debt burden that will be coming up in the next decades when we will realize how much China will have invested in Africa and how much they need to get their money back at some stage. The construction of ports, infrastructure, at the end of the day, these are loans. These are not, that's not money that is just given. Someone has to pay it back. At the end.
A good example, obviously in Asia, where the actual port is now being handled by the Chinese for
Voilà,
9 years.
Voilà. In Sri Lanka, Colombo, yeah. It's
roads being built in Liberia.
Yeah. And then I'm very much afraid for the LDCs because the LDCs, they fall out of the, everyone. That's it. I think that's, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. This was highly illuminating. And you can see, I mean, he didn't touch, as you could see, some we picked up even some questions and which are, there are immense questions. And I think to go back to where you started, economic downturn in many African countries will bring up a number of questions which we even haven't referred to today. So I mean, we can foresee that we can meet very soon and talk more about this Africa-European relationship. But I think, thank you very much. As I said, no one could have done it better than you.
No.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.